I watched in horror as our HOA president grabbed my disabled brother's wheelchair and, with a movement that was as shocking as it was calculated, sent it tumbling down our front steps. Well, that was unfortunate, Karen, I thought bitterly as I struggled to process the scene unfolding before me. It was early evening, and the fading light made every detail of the incident seem surreal, almost as if it were part of a twisted nightmare. My heart pounded in my ears while I clutched the railing, unable to tear my eyes away from the chaotic spectacle. For years, our quiet suburban street had been governed by strict rules and a rigid sense of order enforced by the Homeowners Association. Karen, the self-appointed enforcer, had made it her mission to police every minor infraction, believing that perfection was the only acceptable way to live. But nothing had prepared me for the callous disregard she had shown that day. My brother, who had always struggled with mobility challenges, relied on that wheelchair for every day's journey. And now, that crucial tool of independence lay shattered on the concrete. The shock of the moment quickly gave way to a seething fury. How dare someone in a position of authority treat a vulnerable person with such cruelty? I knew that I couldn't let this injustice stand unchallenged. In that heart-wrenching moment, as I fought back tears and anger, I resolved to make sure Karen learned that actions like these have consequences far beyond a single misstep. I had a secret that few knew. Beneath my quiet demeanor lay a formidable career in law. I was not just a concerned sibling. I was a federal judge, known for my unwavering commitment to justice. And today, Karen's abuse of power was about to meet the full weight of the law. This was more than a personal vendetta. It was a defining moment, a turning point that would force our entire community to confront the abuse of authority. My mind raced with plans of retribution, of exposing every ounce of her misconduct, not only to the board, but to the very public she so desperately wanted to impress. As the last of the light faded, I made a silent vow. Justice would be served, and no one, especially not someone in a position of power, would trample on the rights and dignity of a vulnerable person without facing the consequences. Cedar Crest Estates was a picture of suburban perfection. Neat, uniform houses lined up in identical rows, each with immaculate lawns and perfectly pruned hedges. The community was tightly regulated by the Homeowners Association, a body notorious for its strict rules and even stricter enforcers. Among them, Karen Miller stood out as the embodiment of rigid authority. In her early 50s and always impeccably dressed in conservative business attire, Karen carried a clipboard as if it were a badge of honor. She roamed the cul-de-sac with a hawk-like gaze, ever ready to point out the slightest deviation from the community's meticulously maintained standard. For most residents, the HOA's rules were a necessary burden, a price to pay for the orderly life they enjoyed. But for me, they were a straitjacket. I had grown up in Cedar Crest, but I had always carved out my own way. I inherited a modest plot on the outskirts of the community, a place where I could live more freely and care for my family on my own terms. Among my loved ones was my brother, whose resilience in the face of a disability inspired me daily. Despite his challenges, he had an infectious smile and an unwavering spirit. But that spirit had been nearly broken the day his wheelchair was carelessly sent tumbling down the steps by the very person tasked with upholding our community's order. I had long harbored a secret ambition far removed from the petty squabbles of suburban life. Beneath the calm exterior of a quiet citizen lay a career built on justice and the relentless pursuit of fairness. I was a federal judge, respected and feared for my impartiality and steadfast commitment to the law. My courtroom was where I had seen the worst and the best of human nature, and I had always believed that those in power must be held accountable for their actions. That belief was about to be put to the ultimate test. Cedar Crest Estates, with its manicured lawns and strict rules, had always felt like a gilded cage to me, a place where individuality was sacrificed at the altar of conformity. While most of my neighbors quietly accepted the HOA's draconian mandates, I had always felt the need to stand up for what was right, even if it meant challenging the very system that governed our lives. The incident with my brother's wheelchair wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was a microcosm of the systemic injustice that festered under the guise of community order. The setting of our little suburb had a deceptive calm. Behind the perfectly trimmed hedges and orderly sidewalks, tensions simmered among those who felt crushed by the relentless enforcement of arbitrary rules. For my family, and especially for my brother, that day marked a turning point, a moment when the facade of perfection was shattered by a single, cruel act. And as the community began to whisper about what had happened, I knew that this incident would no longer be confined to hushed conversations in quiet living rooms. It was destined to ignite a firestorm of accountability and change that would soon engulf Cedar Crest Estates. In the immediate aftermath of that fateful incident, a wave of shock and indignation rippled through our small community. Neighbors, who had long been compliant to the HOA's strict regulations, began to murmur in hushed voices about the cruelty of Karen Miller's actions. I spent sleepless nights combing through security footage, gathering every piece of digital evidence that confirmed what I had witnessed. Karen had not only carelessly handled my brother's wheelchair, but had done so with a deliberate air of disregard. Determined to ensure that this abuse of power did not go unpunished, I first took the matter to the HOA board. I submitted a formal complaint, complete with video clips and detailed timestamp logs that documented the incident. My language was measured, yet every word dripped with the raw emotion of betrayal. I argued that my brother's rights had been violated and that the very essence of compassion and justice had been trampled by someone who was supposed to protect our community's values. The board's initial response was tepid. Many members, fearful of Karen's long-standing influence and reputation as the unchallenged enforcer, hesitated to criticize her directly. Rumors swirled that if I pressed too hard, I might become the next target of her wrath. But I was not one to be intimidated, especially not when it came to the welfare of my family and the integrity of our community. I knew that exposing her abuse was not only a personal duty, but a moral imperative. In the days that followed, I began reaching out discreetly to other residents. I learned that I was not alone in my frustration. Several community members had, in the past, witnessed Karen's overzealous interventions, fines for minor infractions, unsympathetic inspections, and even cold indifference toward genuine hardship. Their stories added weight to my complaint, and together we formed a quiet alliance of resistance. The digital evidence I had compiled became a rallying point. On community forums, supportive messages and hashtags like #JusticeForAll and #NoMoreKaren began to gain traction, giving voice to those who had long felt oppressed by an overly rigid system. At the same time, I began preparing for the inevitable confrontation. I knew that Karen would not simply back down. She would double down on her tactics in an effort to reassert her authority. I also realized that my position as a federal judge, though mostly kept private, could serve as a powerful counterbalance. I resolved that if it came time to reveal my true identity, I would do so not for personal gain, but to expose the hypocrisy of those who believed that their power was above the law. I gathered every scrap of evidence: photographs of the shattered wheelchair on the steps, video clips capturing the moment of impact, and detailed written account from neighbors who had witnessed the horror. I compiled these into a digital dossier and shared it with trusted members of the community, ensuring that our voices would be heard far and wide. As the evidence continued to mount, the community's digital petition calling for accountability and reform reached hundreds of signatures in just a few days. Every day, more residents came forward with their own experiences of arbitrary enforcement, and the chorus of dissent grew louder. I could feel the pressure building, not only on the HOA board, but on Karen herself. The time had come for a decisive action, a moment when our collective outrage would force the board to confront the reality of their governance. I scheduled a meeting with the board, fully expecting Karen to be present, clipboard in hand, ready to defend her actions. I rehearsed my statements, knowing that every word would be scrutinized. I was prepared to speak not only for myself, but for every resident who had been silenced by fear and intimidation. My resolve was firm. If justice was not served in that meeting, I would escalate the matter further, revealing my identity as a federal judge and demanding accountability on every level. That meeting, held in the austere boardroom of the Cedar Crest HOA headquarters, marked the beginning of a public showdown. The tension in the room was palpable as I laid out the evidence. Karen's usual calm facade began to crumble as I recounted the events in excruciating detail, her face flushing with a mixture of anger and fear. The board members, initially reluctant to challenge their enforcer, were forced to confront the undeniable truth that a disabled person's rights had been callously trampled on. By the end of the meeting, it was clear that the community was on the brink of demanding drastic change. My words had resonated, and the digital dossier, now circulating widely on social media, had transformed our private grievance into a public outcry. The board was left with no choice but to schedule a final public hearing to address the incident and to consider comprehensive reforms. It was the spark that would ignite a larger movement, a movement to reclaim our community from the tyranny of arbitrary enforcement and to uphold the values of compassion, accountability, and justice. In the wake of the board meeting, the story of Karen's callous acts spread like wildfire through Cedar Crest Estates. Social media exploded with video clips and photographs of the incident, along with detailed accounts from neighbors who had witnessed the fallout. Hashtags such as #NoMoreKaren, #JusticeForDisabled, and #StandUpForRights began trending locally. The digital petition demanding reform of the HOA's enforcement policies quickly garnered thousands of signatures, uniting residents in a common cause against arbitrary power. Local news outlets picked up the story with a mix of incredulity and determination. Reporters were seen outside homes, interviewing residents who spoke passionately about the need for accountability and the protection of vulnerable community members. This is not just about one woman's overreach, one news anchor declared during a live broadcast. It's about a system that allows personal vendettas to override common decency and the rights of our neighbors. The narrative shifted rapidly, from a single incident to a broader commentary on the need for compassionate and fair governance. Within the HOA board, tensions reached a boiling point. Emergency meetings were held in closed sessions, and leaked minutes revealed deep divisions among board members. Some staunchly defended Karen's strict enforcement, arguing that the rules were in place to maintain order. Others, however, recognized that the incident had exposed a disturbing abuse of power that could no longer be ignored. We must protect our residents, especially those who are most vulnerable, one board member was quoted as saying. The internal strife, coupled with the mounting digital evidence, forced the board into a corner. I continued to update my digital dossier, sharing every new piece of evidence and every supportive comment from fellow residents. My online updates, which included detailed accounts, security footage snippets, and heartfelt messages from neighbors, became a rallying point for a movement that demanded change. Every post and every hashtag further eroded the credibility of Karen's overzealous methods and shone a light on the urgent need for reform. Karen, for her part, struggled to maintain control of the narrative. In a series of frantic social media posts and public statements, she tried to claim that her actions were meant to protect the community's interests. But as more and more evidence came to light, her arguments fell flat. Videos of the incident, complete with time-stamped footage showing the wheelchair's descent and eyewitness testimonies, painted an undeniable picture of her negligence and her calculated abuse of power. As the days wore on, the digital momentum became unstoppable. Local community forums and social media groups buzzed with heated debates about the balance between enforcing community rules and protecting individual rights. Neighbors recounted their own experiences of arbitrary fines and intrusive inspections, and the chorus of voices demanding justice grew louder with each passing hour. The phrase, "No more Karen," became a mantra, a defiant call for an end to the tyranny of unchecked authority. In response to the overwhelming public outcry, the HOA board finally announced that a final public hearing would be held to address the incident and to reform the existing policies. The news sent shockwaves through Cedar Crest Estates, and preparations for the hearing began immediately. Flyers were distributed, digital petitions were updated, and local activists organized rallies to ensure that every voice would be heard on the day of the hearing. On the morning of the final hearing, the community center was packed. Residents from every corner of the neighborhood gathered, many carrying signs that read "Justice for our neighbors" and "Protect the vulnerable." The atmosphere was electric, a potent mix of anger, hope, and determination. The digital dossier was projected onto large screens for all to see, its images and footage a stark reminder of the incident that had ignited this movement. Every shared video clip, every supportive hashtag, every testimonial added to the pressure on the HOA board. The community demanded accountability and a thorough reevaluation of the enforcement practices that had allowed someone like Karen to wield her power unchecked. It wasn't just about my brother's wheelchair. It was about ensuring that no vulnerable member of our community would ever be subjected to such callous disregard again. The stage was now set for a dramatic showdown, a final confrontation where the future of Cedar Crest Estates would be decided. The digital evidence, the impassioned voices of the residents, and the unwavering call for justice had all coalesced into a formidable force. In that charged environment, it was clear that the old ways of arbitrary rule enforcement were on the verge of collapse, and a new era of fairness and accountability was about to dawn. The decisive moment arrived on a brisk morning at the Cedar Crest Community Center. The boardroom was filled to capacity with HOA officials, local law enforcement representatives, community leaders, and a sea of determined residents, all gathered for the final public hearing that would decide the fate of our neighborhood's enforcement policies. With a calm yet unyielding presence, Councilwoman Laura Simmons stepped up to the podium, her eyes reflecting the collective resolve of the community that had been pushed to the breaking point. After an exhaustive review of all digital evidence, including time-stamped security footage, detailed logs of complaints, and heartfelt testimonials from residents, we have reached an inescapable conclusion. Councilwoman Simmons began, her voice resonating with authority. It is abundantly clear that the actions taken by Mrs. Karen Miller, specifically her reckless decision to push a disabled individual's wheelchair down the stairs, were not the result of an isolated accident, but of a calculated abuse of power driven by personal bias. Our community's fundamental rights, especially those of our most vulnerable members, must be upheld, and no one should be allowed to impose their will on us without consequence. A heavy silence fell over the room as Simmons continued. Effective immediately, the HOA board will rescind all fines and sanctions imposed as a result of this incident, and we will initiate a full disciplinary review of the practices that allowed such an egregious overreach. Furthermore, new guidelines will be implemented to ensure that every resident's right to safety and dignity is protected. Today's decision is not merely about reversing an arbitrary fine. It is a resounding declaration that Cedar Crest will stand for justice, compassion, and accountability. Her words struck a deep chord, and murmurs of approval rippled throughout the assembly. At that moment, a longtime community advocate, a man known for his unwavering commitment to civil rights, rose to speak. "Today we stand united," he declared, his voice strong and impassioned. "No resident, especially those who are vulnerable, should ever have their rights trampled upon by an overzealous enforcer. Let this vote mark the turning point, a clear signal that our community values dignity, fairness, and respect for all its members. We demand accountability, and we will not rest until every violation of our rights is met with swift and decisive action." His declaration was met with thunderous applause, uniting the room in a powerful call for change. Following his address, a senior officer from the local public safety department presented the final dossier, a meticulously compiled record of all digital evidence, expert testimonies, and official reports that confirmed the nature of the incident. The evidence was irrefutable. Karen's actions had been a blatant abuse of power, and every attempt to justify her behavior was exposed as a gross violation of our community's values. The Internal Affairs panel unanimously endorsed strict disciplinary measures, and the full report was scheduled for immediate public release. Councilwoman Simmons concluded, "Let this resolution mark the dawn of a new era for Cedar Crest, A community where every resident's rights are sacred and where public authority is exercised with integrity and compassion. Our vote today is a resounding declaration that we will protect our freedoms and ensure that no one, no matter how self-righteous, can impose their personal vendettas upon our community without accountability. Together, we stand for justice, transparency, and the inalienable right to live with dignity. Her final words, delivered with unwavering conviction, sealed the turning point in our struggle for justice and human decency. In that defining moment, as every face in the boardroom shone with determination and hope, the balance of power shifted irrevocably. The overwhelming digital evidence and the unified voice of the community forced the HOA board to take decisive action, a turning point that would forever reshape the governance of Cedar Crest. The days of arbitrary, personal vendettas were over, and a future built on respect for individual rights and compassion was finally within our grasp. In the weeks following the historic vote, Cedar Crest experienced a profound transformation. News of the rescinded fines and the sweeping reforms enacted by the HOA board spread rapidly through local media and on social networks, igniting fervent discussions about property rights, community governance, and the protection of vulnerable residents. Editorials in the local newspaper, with headlines such as "A New Dawn for Cedar Crest" and "Community United for Justice," celebrated the decisive actions taken to uphold the dignity and rights of every homeowner. Hashtags like #PropertyRights, #NoMoreHOBullying, and #JusticeForAll trended widely, reinforcing our collective determination to stand against arbitrary abuse of power. Town hall meetings and community forums saw unprecedented attendance as residents gathered to share their stories and envision a future free from the tyranny of personal vendettas. Neighbors, who had long lived in fear of punitive fines and invasive inspections, now spoke proudly about their right to manage their own property with dignity and respect. "Our homes and our lives are our own," one impassioned resident declared at a bustling meeting, his voice echoing through the crowded room. The atmosphere was one of hope and renewal, a promise that Cedar Crest would always protect its most vulnerable and uphold the values of fairness and compassion. Within the reformed HOA board and local public safety departments, swift changes were implemented. Senior officials, led by Director James Carter and Lieutenant Marcus Reed, launched comprehensive training programs focused on ethical conduct, cultural sensitivity, and the responsible management of community resources. Regular internal audits and transparent disciplinary procedures were established to ensure that every complaint was carefully scrutinized and that no resident would ever again be subjected to arbitrary or abusive enforcement. Our duty is to protect the rights and dignity of every member of our community, Lieutenant Reed affirmed during a follow-up press conference, his words resonating with the renewed spirit of reform. Community leaders and local civil rights organizations also mobilized to empower residents further. Workshops, public forums, and educational campaigns were organized to raise awareness about the importance of protecting vulnerable members of the community and to encourage active participation in shaping fair governance. When we unite, our voices can dismantle even the most entrenched systems, a local activist proclaimed at a town hall meeting, inspiring neighbors to join the fight for justice and equality. For me, the journey from confrontation to resolution was both deeply personal and profoundly transformative. My decision to take a stand, not only to protect my family and our property, but also to challenge the arbitrary abuse of power, had ignited a movement that resonated far beyond Cedar Crest. Neighbors who had once been silenced by fear and intimidation found their voices, sharing their own stories of hardship and resistance. The digital evidence that exposed the callousness of Karen's actions became a rallying cry for every resident who believed that dignity, compassion, and the right to live without arbitrary interference were inalienable. Karen Miller, once the formidable enforcer of the HOA's draconian policies, was now reduced to a cautionary tale, a stark reminder that no one is above accountability when a community stands united for justice. Her influence waned as digital records of her past transgressions circulated widely, and her once unquestioned authority crumbled under the weight of public opinion and reform. At a final celebratory event held in the Central Park of Cedar Crest, residents, local officials, and community advocates gathered under the soft glow of the setting sun. A large banner reading "Unity, Freedom, and Dignity" was unfurled between towering oaks, and heartfelt speeches filled the air with promises of a brighter, more inclusive future. Today, we celebrate not just a victory over arbitrary enforcement, but the triumph of our collective dignity and the right of every individual to live with respect, Councilwoman Simmons proclaimed, her voice echoing with unwavering determination. The standing ovation that followed was a powerful affirmation of our shared commitment to protect our freedoms and to ensure that such abuses of power would never again tarnish our community. As each new day dawned over Cedar Crest, the legacy of that fateful confrontation endured as a beacon of transformative change. The story of how an overzealous HOA enforcer pushed my disabled brother's wheelchair downstairs, and how I, a federal judge, stood up to that abuse, became a rallying cry for every resident who believed in justice, compassion, and the inalienable rights of all. Every sunrise now carried with it the promise that in Cedar Crest, truth, dignity, and individual freedom would forever prevail. In the end, what began as a personal battle evolved into a watershed moment for our entire community. We emerged more united, more vigilant, and more determined to safeguard our rights against any form of arbitrary interference. And as the sun rose each morning over our reclaimed neighborhood, it carried with it the promise that Cedar Crest would forever be a place where compassion, integrity, and respect for every individual were cherished above all else.